My name is Sarah Whitmore, and for 11 months, the whole town of Millbrook Falls believed I killed a boy. Let me back up. 2 years ago, I was 34 years old, and I thought my life was finally just a little bit boring. In a good way. I had a daughter, Emily, 7 years old, missing her two front teeth, obsessed with a cartoon about talking dogs. I had a small house on Maple Street with a porch that leaned a little to the left, one I kept meaning to fix and never quite got around to. And I had a job I actually loved. I was an emergency room nurse at Millbrook Falls Regional, the only hospital for 40 miles in any direction. Millbrook Falls is the kind of town where everybody actually does know everybody, or at least knows somebody who does. Population just under 9,000. One high school, two stoplights, a main street with a hardware store, a diner, and a bank that had been in the same family for 3 generations. It's the kind of place that looks from the outside like nothing bad could ever really happen there. I used to believe that too. I want you to understand something before the story gets dark. Because it does get dark. I was good at my job. Not pretty good. Good. I've been an ER nurse for 11 years. I'd held the hands of people taking their last breath, and I'd celebrated with families whose kids survived things that should have killed them. I knew what I was doing. That's the part that still keeps me up at night, honestly. Not that I made a mistake. I didn't make a mistake. My husband, well, ex-husband now, though back then we were still just barely holding on to married, had left 2 years before any of this started. David wasn't a bad man, not really. He just wasn't built for the version of life we had, the one where I worked nights and weekends, and he was the one getting Emily to school most mornings. He said he felt like a single father who happened to be married. I understood that more than I let on at the time. By the time this story starts, David and I had a custody arrangement that mostly worked. Emily lived with me during the week, spent weekends at his place across town. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and it was stable, and stable was worth more to me than almost anything else in the world by then. I'm telling you this now because it matters later. Hold on to it. It was a Tuesday in October. I remember because Emily had a dentist appointment that afternoon, and I'd had to trade a shift to make it work. I was covering a night shift I didn't usually take, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., in a town where nothing usually happens after 10 p.m. Around 11:40, we got the call. Vehicle versus pedestrian, out on Route 9, near the old grain mill. 19-year-old male, head trauma, internal bleeding, unresponsive at the scene. The ambulance brought him in at 11:58 p.m. His name was Jason Whitcomb, 19 years old. He worked part-time at the hardware store on 5th Street, and he was saving up for community college. I know that now. Back then, all I knew was a boy was dying in front of me, and I had maybe minutes to stop it. We worked on him for almost 40 minutes. Dr. Anand was the attending that night, a quiet man who'd been at that hospital longer than I had. I was running the code alongside him, meds, compressions, calling out vitals. We did everything by the book. Everything. I remember his blood pressure crashing twice in the first 10 minutes. I remember calling out for more units of blood, watching the tech run down the hall to the blood bank because our on-floor supply wasn't enough. I remember the CT results coming back and Dr. Anand's face going very still when he saw them. A bleed in the brain that no surgery in a hospital our size could have fixed in time, even if we'd caught it the second the ambulance doors opened. That's the thing nobody wants to hear about trauma medicine. Sometimes the outcome is decided before the patient ever reaches you. Sometimes all you're doing is trying to buy minutes for a family that's still on their way to the hospital, so they get to say goodbye instead of getting a phone call. At 12:41 a.m., Dr. Anand called it. Jason Whitcomb was pronounced dead. I remember standing in that hallway afterward, still in my scrubs, hands shaking a little, the way they do after a code, even after 11 years. I remember thinking about his parents, who hadn't arrived yet. I remember thinking, this is the part of the job nobody prepares you for, telling a mother her son isn't coming home. I did not know, standing in that hallway, that in 6 days I would be the one accused of killing him. Here's what I didn't know that night, and wouldn't find out until much later. Jason Whitcomb hadn't just been hit by a car. He'd been hit by a car driven by Bradley Ashford, 22 years old. Blood alcohol nearly 3 times the legal limit, and the only son of Warren Ashford, the man who owned half of Millbrook Falls. The hardware store where Jason worked, the bank on Main Street, the construction company that had just been awarded the contract to renovate, Of all things, the county courthouse. Warren Ashford didn't just have money in that town, he had the sheriff's golf schedule. He had the mayor's cell phone number. And it turned out he had a plan. 6 days after Jason died, I was called into the hospital administrator's office. Gary Poole had been the administrator for maybe 3 years, a nervous man who wore the same navy tie every single day like it was a uniform. He didn't look at me when I walked in. He told me there was going to be an internal review. He told me there were questions about the medication administered to Jason Whitcomb that night. Questions about dosage. Questions about timing. I told him there was nothing to question. I'd followed protocol to the letter. I'd have staked my license on it. Turns out I did stake my license on it. I just didn't know that yet. Over the next 2 weeks, that internal review turned into something that felt less like a hospital process and more like an interrogation. I was called in 3 more times. Each time, the questions got a little more specific, a little more strange. Not walk us through what happened anymore, but isn't it true that you administered the second dose without a second verification, phrased in a way that made it sound like an accusation dressed up as a question? I asked more than once where these questions were coming from. Gary Poole never gave me a straight answer. He'd just adjust that navy tie and say something about due diligence and an abundance of caution, phrases that meant nothing and everything at the same time. What I didn't understand yet was that Gary Poole wasn't actually running that review. He was reading from a script somebody else had written for him. I'd find out much later that Warren Ashford sat on the hospital's board of trustees, had in fact personally funded the wing where our ER was housed. His name was on a little brass plaque by the front entrance that I must have walked past 4,000 times without ever really looking at it. I looked at it plenty after that. Here's the thing about a small town with one powerful family in it. The story doesn't need to be true. It just needs to be told by the right person to the right people at the right time. Within a week, the story being told in Millbrook Falls was this. Jason Whitcomb hadn't died from being struck by a car going 51 miles an hour on Route 9. He died because the nurse on duty that night, me, had made a critical medication error, given him something that interacted badly with his injuries. Something that, if it hadn't happened, he might have lived. I want to be very clear with you. This was not true, but I didn't know that week just how far it was going to go. I thought foolishly in hindsight that the truth would simply win. That's what I'd been taught my whole life. Tell the truth, work hard, and things work out. My mother used to say that to me. My grandmother said it to her. Nobody in my family had ever been on the other side of a courtroom before. 3 weeks after Jason died, I was placed on unpaid leave, pending investigation. 4 weeks after that, the county district attorney, a man named Russell Wexler, who I would later learn had received a very generous campaign donation from something called the Ashford Family Trust, announced charges. Criminal negligence resulting in death. They arrested me on a Thursday morning in my driveway in front of my daughter. They read me my rights standing in my own driveway next to a flower bed I'd planted the spring before. I remember the metal of the handcuffs being colder than I expected. I remember one of the deputies, not Ruiz, a different one, being almost apologetic about it, like he didn't quite believe the paperwork either, but had a job to do regardless. At the county jail, they took my fingerprints, my mugshot, my shoelaces. I sat in a holding cell for 6 hours before anyone came to process my bail, staring at a stain on the ceiling shaped a little like the state of Florida, thinking, absurdly, about whether Emily had remembered to bring her library book back before it was due. I remember Emily's face through the car window as they put me in the back of the sheriff's cruiser. She didn't understand what was happening. She just knew her mom was crying and there were flashing lights on our quiet street and a neighbor was filming it on her phone. That video ended up on the local news that night. By the next morning, half the town had already decided I was guilty, not because they'd seen any evidence. Because a girl at the grocery store checkout had heard from her cousin who worked at the hospital that the nurse did something to that boy. That's how it spreads in a small town. Like a fire in dry grass. Nobody needs a match, just a spark and a wind that's blowing the right direction. I went to the pharmacy on 5th Street about a week after the arrest just to pick up a prescription, and I swear the whole store went quiet when the bell over the door rang. The pharmacist, a man I'd known since Emily was born, wouldn't meet my eyes when he handed me the bag. A woman I didn't even recognize muttered something to her friend, not quiet enough, about how some people should lose their license just for showing their face in public. I stopped going out much after that. Started having groceries delivered. Started timing errands for hours I knew the store would be empty. I lost my job outright within the month, pending the outcome of legal proceedings, they said, which everyone understood to mean forever. I lost most of my savings to a lawyer who, I'll be honest with you, wasn't very good and didn't seem to think I was worth trying very hard for. I sold my car first, an old Honda that wasn't worth much but got me a few $1,000s I badly needed. Then I sold my mother's wedding ring, which I'd kept in a drawer since she passed, telling myself I'd give it to Emily one day. I told myself I'd buy it back eventually. I never did. Some things you let go of, and they just stay gone. I fell 2 months behind on the mortgage before a cousin of mine, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, quietly wired me enough to catch back up. No questions asked, no expectation of being paid back. I still don't fully know how to thank her for that. Some debts aren't really about money. I lost friends. Women I'd known since high school stopped answering my texts. One of them, Denise, who I used to carpool with to church every Sunday, actually crossed the street when she saw me coming out of the pharmacy. Ugh. But the part that nearly broke me, the part I still think about, was Emily's school. Another parent complained, said she didn't feel comfortable with her kid sitting next to that woman's daughter at lunch. The school didn't do anything about it officially, but Emily stopped getting invited to birthday parties. My 7-year-old daughter was being punished for something I hadn't even done. Ugh. And then David called. He'd never been unkind about custody before. Never once, in 2 years, tried to use anything against me. But his voice was different on the phone that night, careful in a way I didn't like. He said his lawyer had just suggested, he kept saying, like that made it softer, that maybe, given the circumstances, Emily should stay with him full-time until things got resolved. I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone so tight my knuckles went white. I asked him if he actually believed I'd done what they were saying. He was quiet for a long moment before he said, "I don't know what to believe anymore, Sarah." That's the problem. That's the sentence that broke something in me. Not the arrest, not the pharmacy. That sentence, from the father of my daughter, on a random Tuesday night in November. We didn't end up in court over it. Not that time. My lawyer at the time, the one who wasn't very good, managed to get David to agree to hold off until after the criminal case resolved. But I spent that whole winter knowing that somewhere in a drawer at David's house there was a folder his lawyer had already started building, just in case. Just waiting to see which way the wind blew. I want to pause here and tell you something because I think it matters. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being accused of something you didn't do, in a place where everyone has already made up their mind. It's not the same as grief. It's not the same as being scared, though I was scared too. It's the loneliness of watching people you've known your whole life look at you like you're a stranger, like you might be capable of something monstrous. I used to lie awake replaying that night in the ER, second by second, wondering if I'd missed something. Even though I knew, I hadn't. That's what it does to you. It makes you doubt your own memory of your own competence because the whole world is telling you a different story than the one you lived. The public defender I'd been assigned after my savings ran dry was a young man named Marcus Cole, 29 years old, maybe 30. He'd been in Millbrook Falls for less than 2 years, which in that town made him basically a foreigner. Some people said that's exactly why the county assigned him to my case. Nobody thought a stranger with no connections could do much damage to the Ashford family's version of events. They were wrong about that. Marcus came to my house the week before the trial was set to begin, sat at my kitchen table, and asked me to walk him through that entire night one more time. Every detail. Every minute. And then he asked me a question nobody else had bothered to ask. "Sarah," he said, "who else was in that trauma bay with you?" I found out later from one of the court clerks who liked to talk why Marcus Cole cared so much about a case everyone else had already written off. 2 years before he'd come to Millbrook Falls, Marcus had worked a similar case back in the city he'd grown up in. A young man accused of a robbery he hadn't committed, a case Marcus had believed in and fought for, right up until his client took a plea deal out of pure exhaustion, tired of sitting in a county jail waiting for a trial that kept getting pushed back. Innocent and still, in the end, a guilty plea on his record, because the system had simply worn him down faster than the truth could catch up. Marcus told me, much later, that he promised himself after that case that he'd never let exhaustion win again, not on his watch, not if he could help it. I didn't know any of that yet, sitting at my kitchen table that afternoon. I just knew that for the first time in months, someone was asking me questions like the answers actually mattered. I told him. Dr. Anand, a tech named Priya, a respiratory therapist who'd rotated in for part of it. Marcus asked if any of them had given statements. I told him Dr. Anand had. Very brief, very careful. He hadn't said I'd done anything wrong exactly, but he also hadn't defended me, which felt like its own kind of betrayal at the time. I understand it a little better now. Dr. Anand had 2 kids in that hospital's daycare and a mortgage, and Gary Poole controlled both of our paychecks. Nobody had gotten a statement from Priya, the tech. Marcus wrote her name down and underlined it twice. Here's something I didn't know back then, that Marcus explained to me at that kitchen table. In a case like mine, the prosecution doesn't need a mountain of evidence. They need one clean, simple story and a town that's already primed to believe it. Russell Wexler's story was simple: careless nurse, dead boy, dosage error. It fit what people already wanted to believe because the alternative, that the mayor's golfing buddy's drunk son had killed someone and money had made it disappear, was a story most people in that town weren't ready to tell themselves. Not yet. Marcus's job, he told me, wasn't just to prove I hadn't made an error. It was to give that town a different story, one that fit the facts better than the one they'd already swallowed. The trial started on a gray Monday in February. I remember the courtroom smelled like old carpet and coffee. I remember Judge Harmon, a heavy-set man with reading glasses perched at the end of his nose, who'd presided over Millbrook Falls courtroom for almost 20 years and had, as I'd later learn, played poker with Warren Ashford every second Friday of the month for at least half of them. I remember looking out at the gallery and seeing Jason Whitcomb's mother in the second row. Her name was Carol. She was staring at me with an expression I will never forget. Not hatred, exactly. Something worse. Grief. But it found a place to put itself down. I didn't blame her. I still don't. She was told a story too. Jury selection had taken most of the previous week. Marcus had fought hard to keep 2 particular people off that jury: a man who golfed at the same club as Warren Ashford, and a woman whose brother-in-law did contract work for Ashford Construction. Both got dismissed eventually, though it cost Marcus most of his allotted challenges to do it. In his opening statement, Russell Wexler barely mentioned Bradley Ashford at all. He talked about Jason, about a mother who lost her only son, about a nurse who, he said, had gotten careless during a routine night shift with fatal consequences. He said the word careless 4 times in 11 minutes. I counted because counting was the only thing keeping my hands from shaking under the table. Marcus's opening was shorter. He told the jury that they were going to hear a story that sounded simple, and that simple stories are sometimes exactly that, too simple to be true. He asked them to keep one question in the back of their minds through the whole trial. Ask yourselves, he said, who benefits from this story being the one that gets told? Nobody in that jury box understood yet what he meant. I'm not sure I fully understood it myself, not that morning. The prosecution's case took 2 days to present. Russell Wexler walked the jury through the medication timeline, through an expert witness, a doctor from 2 counties over who I'd never met, who'd been paid a very specific consulting fee, who testified that in his opinion, the sequence and dosage of medications administered could have contributed to a fatal cardiac event. Could have. Not did. Could have. I watched 3 of the jurors nod along like that word didn't matter. Like could have was the same thing as did. Marcus objected twice, quietly, and got overruled both times. When it was Marcus's turn to cross-examine that expert, he didn't attack his credentials, which surprised me at the time. Instead, he asked him one simple question, over and over in slightly different ways. Doctor, did you personally review the full autopsy report before forming your opinion? The man hedged, said he'd reviewed the materials provided by the district attorney's office. Marcus asked what materials, specifically. It turned out he'd been given a 2-page summary, not the full report, not the imaging, just a summary written by someone in Russell Wexler's office that happened to leave out the parts about the collision injuries entirely. I watched a couple of jurors' faces shift just slightly at that. Not enough to win the case. Not yet. But enough to plant a small, useful seed of doubt about how carefully any of this had actually been put together. Gary Poole testified Wednesday morning, called by the prosecution to describe the hospital's internal review. He wouldn't look at me the whole time he was on the stand, kept adjusting that same navy tie, his voice going thin and careful whenever Russell Wexler asked him a leading question about concerns that had been raised about my performance. On cross-examination, Marcus asked him plainly whether he'd initiated that internal review himself or whether someone else had suggested it to him. Gary Poole hesitated long enough that the hesitation itself became an answer. He finally said the board had recommended looking into it, and when Marcus asked which board member specifically, Russell Wexler objected before Gary Poole had to say the name out loud. The objection was sustained, but I watched two jurors glance at each other anyway. Some questions don't need an answer to land. By Wednesday afternoon, I could see it in people's faces. They'd already decided. The trial was just a formality on the way to a verdict everyone had written in their heads 3 months earlier. Thursday morning, Marcus called his first witness, Priya Patel. The trauma tech. I remember Russell Wexler's face when her name was called, a flicker of something. Not quite worry. More like a man realizing a half second too late that he left a door unlocked somewhere in his house. Priya had left Millbrook Falls Regional 4 months after Jason's death, taken a job 2 states away. Marcus had spent 3 weeks tracking her down and then had flown out on his own dime to sit across from her at her kitchen table, the same way he'd sat at mine. Marcus told me later that Priya had been hesitant at first, scared, honestly, of what testifying against a hospital system connected to a man like Warren Ashford might do to her career. Even from 2 states away, small medical communities talk to each other more than people realize. A reputation can follow you further than a state line. What changed her mind, Marcus said, was one simple question he'd asked her at that kitchen table. He asked if she could live with herself 5 years from now, knowing she'd had the chance to tell the truth and had let fear talk her out of it. She'd sat with that question for a long moment. Then she'd started looking for flights. She'd agreed to testify. Priya's testimony took 40 minutes. It felt like 4 hours. She confirmed in careful, precise medical language that every medication I'd administered that night had been correctly dosed, correctly timed, and standard protocol for Jason's presenting injuries. She confirmed she personally double-checked 2 of the doses herself because that was procedure for high-acuity trauma cases, and I'd asked her to, out loud, in front of Dr. Anand. Russell Wexler tried to rattle her on cross-examination, pointing out that she'd left the hospital shortly after Jason's death, suggesting to the jury that maybe she'd left out of guilt or fear of what she'd done. Priya didn't flinch. She said she'd left because the job market 2 states overpaid better, and her fiancé had gotten transferred there for work, and she could produce the moving paperwork to prove it if he'd like to see it. A couple of jurors actually smiled at that. It was the first time all week I'd seen anyone in that jury box look anything other than grim. And then Marcus asked her the question that changed everything. Priya, in your professional opinion, based on the injuries you observed and the imaging you saw that night, what actually killed Jason Whitcomb? The prosecution objected. Judge Harmon, looking uncomfortable in a way I hadn't seen from him yet, allowed the question. Priya looked at the jury and said, massive internal hemorrhaging and traumatic brain injury, consistent with high-speed blunt force trauma, the kind you see from a car accident, not from medication. You could have heard a pin drop in that courtroom. Russell Wexler stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. He tried to object again, tried to argue Priya wasn't qualified to give that opinion, that it belonged to the medical examiner alone. Which brought Marcus to a second witness. The medical examiner who'd actually performed Jason's autopsy? Not the paid expert from 2 counties over, but the real one. A woman named Dr. Feld who worked for the state, who'd filed her original report 11 months earlier. The report Russell Wexler's office had never entered into evidence. Marcus had requested it through a records request that took him nearly 2 months to get answered. When it finally arrived, it took him 1 afternoon to read it and understand exactly what he was holding. Dr. Feld took the stand Thursday afternoon. Her original autopsy report, dated the week after Jason's death, listed cause of death as blunt force craniocerebral trauma and hemorrhagic shock consistent with motor vehicle collision at high velocity. There was no mention, none, of medication as a contributing factor. Marcus asked her directly, Doctor, in your professional opinion, could the medications administered by Nurse Whitmore that night have caused or contributed to Jason Whitcomb's death? She said no. Plainly. without hesitation. He was already fatally injured, she said, before he arrived at that hospital. Nothing done in that trauma bay could have saved him, and nothing done in that trauma bay could have. I watched Carol Whitcomb in the second row when Dr. Feld said that. Her hand went up to her mouth. She had known either. Nobody had shown her that report. She'd spent 11 months believing a story too, just a different one than the rest of the town. She'd been told her son's death was somebody's careless mistake, something that could have been prevented if only the nurse on duty had been more careful. Now she was hearing for the first time that her son had never had a chance, that the only person responsible for his death was whoever had been behind the wheel of that car. I'll be honest with you. In that moment, watching her face break, I wasn't thinking about my own case anymore. I was just thinking, this poor woman deserved the truth 11 months ago. Marcus's next move was the one that really mattered. He asked Dr. Feld one more question. Doctor, did your office ever receive a follow-up inquiry regarding the vehicle involved in this collision? Specifically, blood alcohol testing on the driver? Russell Wexler objected furiously, said it was outside the scope. Judge Harmon and I still wonder to this day what was going through his head in that moment, whether he was thinking about all those Friday night poker games actually sustained the objection. But it didn't matter anymore, because the question had already been asked, out loud, in a courtroom full of Millbrook Falls' residents, in front of 2 reporters from the county paper who'd shown up that day for the first time. You can't unask a question like that. Not in a town that size. That night, I got a call from Marcus. He almost never called after hours, but I could hear something in his voice. Careful excitement. The kind you have when you're holding something fragile and important. Her name was Jenna Ruiz. No relation to the deputy, as it turned out, just a coincidence that would end up mattering more than either of them expected. She worked for the county paper, mostly covered school board meetings and county fair results. The kind of reporting nobody usually thinks much about until the day it turns out to matter. He told me she'd gone digging that evening after hearing that question in court and had filed a public records request of her own for the police report from the night of the accident, the original one, not the summary that had been circulating. It had never been sealed. It had just never been requested by anyone who knew to ask. And in that original report, buried in an officer's handwritten notes from the scene, was a single line that the sheriff's department had somehow never mentioned in 11 months. Driver of vehicle exhibited signs of intoxication. Field sobriety declined. No blood alcohol test administered at scene per Sheriff Kessler's instruction. Jenna's story ran in the front page of the county paper that Friday morning, under a headline that simply read, "Questions raised over handling of Ashford accident." It wasn't sensational. It didn't accuse anyone of anything outright. It just laid out the timeline, plainly, and let the readers draw their own conclusions. That's often how these things actually start to unravel, in my experience now. Not with a dramatic accusation, but with one careful person asking one careful question and writing down the answer honestly instead of the way somebody powerful would prefer it written. Friday morning, the courtroom was packed in a way I hadn't seen all week. Word travels fast in a small town, and by Friday morning, half of Millbrook Falls had heard there was a police report with Bradley Ashford's name in it and a decision by Sheriff Kessler personally to skip a blood alcohol test that every single other DUI-adjacent accident in that county's history had received as standard procedure. Marcus called the responding officer to the stand. A young deputy named Tom Ruiz, only 26, 2 years on the job. I watched him sit down and I could see, right away, that this wasn't a man who wanted to be there. Marcus asked him about that night, about the instruction not to test Bradley Ashford. Deputy Ruiz looked at Sheriff Kessler sitting in the front row of the gallery. And then he looked at the jury, and he told the truth. Sheriff Kessler called it in personally, Ruiz said. Told me and my partner not to administer the test on scene. Said Mr. Ashford's father would handle it privately with the family doctor. Said it wasn't necessary given the circumstances. Marcus asked what circumstances those were. Deputy Ruiz was quiet for a moment. Mr. Ashford's father arrived at the scene before we'd even finished securing it, he said. I don't know how he got there that fast. I just know he was there, and after that, things moved different than they usually do. The courtroom erupted. Judge Harmon banged his gavel so hard I thought it might crack. I wish I could tell you Warren Ashford stood up right then and confessed to everything like something out of a movie. That's not what happened. He sat very still in the gallery, his jaw tight, his face the color of old paper. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Everyone in that room could see it on him anyway. What actually happened was quieter and in some ways more damning. The county district attorney's office, Russell Wexler's own office, requested a recess. 2 hours later, they came back and formally moved to dismiss all charges against me. Not guilty. Dismissed. As if the case had never had any business being brought at all. I remember Judge Harmon reading the motion out loud, his voice flat, like a man reading a grocery list rather than the words that were about to hand me my whole life back. I remember Marcus's hand on my shoulder before I'd even fully registered what had been said. I remember turning around and seeing Carol Whitcomb still sitting in the second row, not moving, staring at some point on the wall behind the judge's bench that wasn't really there. Somebody in the gallery actually clapped once before someone else shushed them. It didn't feel like a moment for clapping. It felt like a moment for sitting very still and trying to understand that 11 months of your life had just been handed back to you in pieces, and it was going to take a while to figure out how they fit together again. Because by then, it was very clear to everyone in that room, including Russell Wexler, that continuing to prosecute me would mean continuing to answer questions about Sheriff Kessler, about that missing blood test, and about exactly how fast Warren Ashford had managed to arrive at an accident scene on a dark stretch of Route 9 at midnight. I didn't feel relief when Judge Harmon read the dismissal. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect a certain kind of ending to a story like this, and I don't want to give you a fake one. What I felt mostly was exhaustion, and something close to anger that took me weeks to even name properly. 11 months of my life had been taken from me. My job, my savings, my daughter's sense of safety, my own sense of who I was in that town, because it had been more convenient for powerful people to blame a nurse than to hold a rich man's drunk son accountable. Nobody handed me back those 11 months. That's not how this works. Nobody ever gets that back. The same local news station that had aired that video of my arrest in my own driveway ran a follow-up piece about a week after the dismissal. 30 seconds, very near the end of the broadcast, mentioning that charges against the Millbrook Falls nurse had been dropped following new evidence. No apology, no mention of the 11 months, no mention of my name being dragged through that town for a crime that had never actually happened. I called the station once just to ask if they'd considered doing a fuller story, something that actually corrected the record instead of just quietly letting it fade. The producer was polite, said she'd look into it. Nothing ever came of it. I've learned that the correction almost never gets the same airtime as the accusation. That imbalance is its own kind of injustice, smaller than a courtroom, but real, all the same. But something did happen in the weeks that followed, and I think it matters, so let me tell you about it. The state attorney general's office opened an investigation into Sheriff Kessler's department, not just for that missed blood alcohol test, but for a pattern, it turned out, of similar arrangements involving the Ashford family going back almost a decade. Parking tickets that disappeared, a drunk and disorderly charge against Bradley Ashford 2 years earlier that never made it into any official record at all. Sheriff Kessler resigned before he could be formally removed. Russell Wexler did not run for re-election that fall. I imagine the campaign donations from the Ashford Family Trust dried up rather suddenly once the trust's own patriarch became a subject of interest. There was a town meeting in March, one of those standing room only ones at the community center, where the interim sheriff and a representative from the attorney general's office answered questions for almost 3 hours. I went, even though part of me didn't want to. I sat in the back. Nobody recognized me at first, or if they did, nobody said anything. About halfway through, an older man stood up, someone I didn't know, a farmer by the look of his hands, and asked the question that I think everyone in that room had been circling around all night without quite landing on it. How many other things, he asked, did this department decide weren't necessary because of who was asking? Nobody had a clean answer for him. The silence that followed said more than any answer could have. And Bradley Ashford, the young man who had actually been driving the car that struck Jason Whitcomb drunk at nearly 3 times the legal limit, was finally charged. Vehicular manslaughter. Driving under the influence. Obstruction, once it came out that his father had helped move him to a private clinic out of state for 2 weeks immediately after the accident, time suspiciously close to when his blood alcohol level would have still been detectable. He took a plea deal, eventually. 4 years. He's out now, I understand. I don't know what kind of man he's become. I hope, for his own sake as much as anyone else's, that it's a better one than the boy who ran from that scene. I wasn't in the courtroom the day he was sentenced. I'd had enough of that particular room to last a lifetime by then. But Marcus went, and he called me afterward to tell me how it went. He said Bradley Ashford cried when the judge read the sentence. Said his father sat 2 rows back alone. His wife had left him sometime that winter, taking whatever was left of the family standing in that town along with her, moving to live near her sister 3 states away. Warren Ashford, for the first time in the whole story, looked like a man whose money hadn't actually protected him from anything that mattered. Marcus also told me that before they led Bradley out of the courtroom, he turned around and looked for Carol Whitcomb in the gallery. Found her, mouthed the words, "I'm sorry." She didn't respond. She just watched him go. I think that was the right response, honestly. Some apologies arrive so late they're not really for the person who's owed them anymore. They're just for the person giving them, so they can feel like they said something. Warren Ashford was never criminally charged for anything specific enough to stick. Money buys you that too, sometimes even at the very end. But I heard, and this is the one part of this story where I'll admit I felt something close to satisfaction, that the county commission quietly declined to renew his construction company's courthouse contract. The same courthouse where I'd once stood accused. They gave it to a contractor from the next county over instead. Small towns have long memories, once they finally get the real story. As for me, my nursing license was fully reinstated within 2 months, though it took the state board almost that long to process the paperwork, which felt like its own small cruelty after everything. Millbrook Falls Regional offered me my old job back. I said no, not out of spite. I want to be clear about that. I just couldn't walk back into that building every day and remember standing in that hallway in my scrubs with my hands still shaking 6 days before my whole life fell apart. Some places you just can't go back to, even once they've apologized. I took a position at a hospital 2 towns over instead. Longer drive, better people, as it turned out. David called about a week after the charges were dismissed. I braced myself honestly, half expecting him to bring up custody again, some new circumstance his lawyer had thought up. Instead, he just said he was sorry. Properly sorry, not the careful lawyered kind of sorry from that November phone call. He said he should have believed me from the start, and that watching Emily ask him every weekend why her friends weren't allowed to come over anymore had made him realize, too late, exactly what his doubt had cost. On top of everything else it had already cost me. I told him I appreciated it. I meant it mostly. But I also told him that should have believed me doesn't undo a folder his lawyer had sitting in a drawer for 3 months just in case. Some things you can apologize for. That doesn't mean the apology erases them. We're better now, David and I. Co-parenting works again, mostly. But something in me still checks, every so often, to make sure that drawer stays closed. Denise, the woman who used to carpool with me to church, who crossed the street to avoid me outside the pharmacy, showed up on my porch about 3 weeks after the charges were dismissed, holding a casserole dish like it was 1955 and somebody had died. She didn't say much. Just that she was sorry, that she should have called, instead of believing rumors, that she hoped I could forgive her someday, even if it wasn't today. I let her in. We didn't go back to exactly what we were before. I don't think you ever fully do after something like that. But we talk again now. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes people surprise you in both directions, and you have to decide which surprises you're willing to hold on to. Carol Whitcomb reached out to me about 4 months after the trial ended. I want to tell you about this because I think it might be the part of the story that matters most. She asked to meet me at a diner on the edge of town, somewhere neither of us was likely to run into anyone we knew. She looked older than she had in that courtroom. Grief does that to a person, I've learned, in ways that keep unfolding long after the worst of it is supposed to be over. She apologized to me for believing the story, for not asking harder questions 11 months earlier when there was still time for it to matter less. I told her she didn't owe me an apology. She'd been lied to just as thoroughly as everyone else had, just with higher stakes for her own heart. We sat in that diner for almost 2 hours. We didn't solve anything. Her son was still gone. My 11 months were still gone. But we understood each other, finally, in a way that the whole rest of that town never quite managed to. There was a night, maybe 6 months into my new job, when we had a bad one come through. A teenager, motorcycle accident, Touch and go for almost an hour. We got him through it. I remember standing in the hallway afterward, hands shaking a little, same as always, and one of the younger nurses on my team said, "You're really good at staying calm in there. How do you do that?" I didn't tell her the whole story. Just said I'd had a lot of practice trusting myself even when everyone around me didn't. She nodded, like that made sense. And maybe someday, if she ever needs to hear the rest of it, I'll tell her. Emily's still got some scars from that year, if I'm honest. She's 9 now, and every so often something small will bring it back up for her. A police car passing on the street, a kid at school repeating something their parents said at the dinner table 2 years ago that should have died there. Kids remember more than we want them to. But she's also the reason I kept fighting when I wanted to just take whatever plea deal Russell Wexler's office was quietly dangling in front of Marcus early on, just to make it stop. I kept thinking, if I plead to something I didn't do just to end this faster, what does that teach her about what to do when the world lies about you? So we didn't take the deal. We went the hard way. And it was hard. I won't pretend otherwise, not for 1 second, to anybody listening to this who might be going through something like it themselves right now. About a year after all of it ended, I got a letter in the mail, no return address. Inside was a single page, handwritten, from a woman I'd never met, 3 counties over. She said she'd read about my case in a regional paper that had picked up Jenna's original story. She said she was a home health aide who'd been blamed a few years back for a medication mix-up that hadn't actually been her fault either. A family with more money and more lawyers than her had needed someone to blame, and she'd been the convenient one standing there. She never got her Marcus, never got her Priya, her Deputy Ruiz, her Jenna. Her case just quietly ended her career and her reputation in that county, and she'd spent 4 years since rebuilding a smaller, quieter life somewhere nobody knew her story. She wrote that reading about what happened to me had made her cry, not because it was sad, but because for the first time in 4 years, she felt like maybe the world did occasionally work the way it's supposed to, even if it hadn't for her. She said she just wanted someone to know that her story was real too, even without a courtroom scene to prove it. I still have that letter. I keep it in the same drawer where my mother's wedding ring used to sit before I sold it. It reminds me that for every story that gets a courtroom moment and a reporter willing to ask one more question, there are probably a dozen more that don't. That's not a comfortable thought, but I think it's an honest one, and I'd rather carry an honest, uncomfortable thought than a comfortable false one. I learned that the hard way this past couple of years. I think about Priya sometimes, the tech who flew back on her own time to testify, who had nothing to gain from it and a fair amount to lose professionally in a small medical community where word travels. I think about Deputy Ruiz, 26 years old, who looked his own sheriff in the eye in open court and told the truth anyway, knowing exactly what that might cost him in a department that small. I think about Marcus Cole, who could have done the bare minimum on a public defender's salary for a case everyone assumed was already lost, and instead flew across 2 states on money he didn't really have to spare, because he believed the story the town had been told wasn't the whole story. Justice, in my experience, doesn't arrive on its own. It doesn't show up just because it's owed. It shows up because a handful of people, usually people with less power than the ones they're standing up to, decide to tell the truth anyway, even when it costs them something. I don't know exactly why I wanted to tell you this story tonight. Maybe because somewhere out there, right now, there's a nurse or a teacher or a mechanic or a mother sitting in a room being told that the story everyone believes about them is the only story that matters. And I want that person to know something I wish somebody had told me. Back in that hallway in my scrubs, before any of this started. The truth doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient for the people with money and connections. It waits. Sometimes it waits longer than feels bearable, but it waits. And sometimes all it takes to bring it back into the light is one tech who flies home to testify, one deputy who won't lie under oath, and one young lawyer nobody thought would amount to much in a town that size. If you're in the middle of something like this right now, if you're the one everyone's already decided about before you've even had the chance to tell your side, I want to say one thing to you directly, and I want you to actually hear it. Don't take the easy way out just to make the noise stop. I know how tempting that is. I know how tired you are. I was tired too, more tired than I have words for. But the version of you that gives in to a false story because it's faster isn't protecting yourself. It's just letting the lie win a little sooner than it would have anyway. Find your Marcus, your Priya, your Deputy Ruiz. They exist even in the smallest towns, even when it feels like everyone's already against you. Sometimes you have to look a little harder to find them, but they're out there, and it only takes one of them believing you to change the whole shape of the story. Thank you for listening to my story tonight. If it moved you, if it made you angry or hopeful, or made you think of someone in your own life who deserved the truth and didn't get it in time, I'd love to hear about it. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, real people, impossible situations, and the moment the truth finally makes its way into the room, stick around. There's always another story waiting. And if nobody's told you this in a while, you deserve the truth. All of you, wherever you're listening from tonight. You deserve people willing to look a little harder before they decide what to believe about you. Take care of each other out there. Good night, everyone.